Renaissance. At the end of Middle history, the Renaissance starts. You've had history. Most of you have, I would guess. When I say Renaissance, what comes to your mind? Let's have a few, there's probably a lot of different answers. Let's have each of you think of something. What comes to your, it shouldn't be a long discussion, but what comes to mind when I say Renaissance? Let's just see, everybody should be able to think of something. Say, unless it's like, that's the period of history I didn't learn anything from. So, Rick?
Well, around my town we have what's called a Renaissance fair, where people dress up like that, and they got a wall around it, and they live like it. And
Castles, fairs,
yeah.
Funny outfits. Okay, that's what you think of when you hear Renaissance, all right? Sure. It's that time period. Sarah?
The revival of like art and literature.
Okay, revival of art and literature. She picked two things there.
I was thinking about the word rebirth and then Michelangelo and Van Gogh.
Okay, rebirth, Michelangelo, Van Gogh.
I was thinking like classical music, where it's starting to shift away from just church music to becoming.
Okay, in music, we're shifting from just church music, Gregorian chants, and we're beginning to have more complexity in classical music. And Caitlin?
They really took music to.
I'm sorry?
They explored the arts more.
Okay, exploring the arts more. Okay, all those will be true of the Renaissance time period. Thinking along educational lines, let's say in the Renaissance time period, there's going to be a rebirth, or that's kind of classical, kind of points us backwards anyway, so I don't know if I want to say rebirth. But it's the time of the flourishing of classical humanism. Classical humanism. Renaissance, classical humanism. Not secular humanism, but yes, humanism. Okay, so there is, in the sense that the Renaissance brings to us now, if you, I study these kinds of things, you probably never did. But if you checked into going to other schools, especially if they were secular schools, you might have saw a section in the catalog or something that was titled the humanities. How many have ever heard of studies in the humanities? Some. Okay, so studies in the humanities are going to be your fine arts and your literature, things about humankind. Not STEM, which is what's STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or something like that. STEM is not the humanities. Okay, so so classical humanism is not necessarily, okay, secular humanism is a religion. Classical humanism is more study, is a subject of study, I would say. What do people do? I just say that so that you don't, because as soon as I say humanism, as Christians we say bad. Okay? Now, I would say sure, flawed, but not bad. Like when you hear humanism and think bad, what you're thinking of is secular humanism. And I'm not saying secular humanism wouldn't see some of its roots in classical humanism, but classical humanism was very much still influenced. I mean, it was a way of life to be a part of the church and religious things. Not the church that we would be a part of necessarily, but even people in our heritage wouldn't have much trouble with most of what's happening during classical human studies. So, classical humanism. Let me give you a few general characteristics of this time period, which seems to be, I don't know, I'm not the general historian, so I don't know the start of it and the end of it. We should recognize that when we're talking about periods in history, it's not like the newspaper said, folks, today's the last day of Renaissance. Tomorrow starts the Reformation. You know, we're in our 130th year of the Reformation, and in 5 weeks the Enlightenment is going to start. And the paper didn't say things like that. It's people today that look back and say, well, I mean, Enlightenment people claim to be enlightened and all that, but they didn't, and they wanted to be different than the people before them, but they wouldn't have said, you know, guys, the Reformation is over. It ended on, you know, now we're with the, you know, they might have said, let's get with the times. Okay, that's all old times. But anyway, so, you know, the dates, I don't know for sure. That's where I would rather just go with order. You know, this came and then this and then this, and they kind of go overlap. They do influence. What's happening now, well, it influences what's going to happen. And what's happening now is influenced and somewhat caused by what has happened before. So they're definitely connected. Anyway, general characteristics of Renaissance is this time period, educators, and I would say education, we should remember that education is culture. Okay? The culture passes itself on through education. I would say that since there was not much education there was less education, let's put it that way, in the Middle History, we have less culture taking place there. There's things happening, obviously, but there's less. And there wasn't as much, we have rise and fall, Charlemagne particularly, of learning. Okay? But the Renaissance comes about as a further result of discovery of the Crusades. The Crusades, they discover Aristotle and all that, they begin to do that, and as that builds, we have even more interest, or the interest in the classical humanists, which would be the Greeks and the Romans. They're humanists, they studied human nature, they have tremendous amount of philosophical thoughts about human nature, how it works, and much of it is true. And so people are rediscovering that. It's a rebirth of learning, Renaissance, rebirth. And most of it is interested in literary and artistic things rather than theology. Now, in Northern Europe, there was more interest in theology than Southern Europe. When you think of Renaissance, I immediately think of Italy and France and that also. I don't know about you. But if you're thinking Germany, then you're going to have more. They are interested in classical humanism, but they are also a little more interested in theology there. And I'm not saying that in Italy no one's interested in theology. Generalizations here. Generally more interested in literature and art and those types of artistic things, fine arts, than theology. And in the North, a little more interested in theology, but still, as a whole, the Renaissance is not so interested in theology. The Renaissance begins to really value or cherish the wisdom of the ancients. They cherished antiquity's wisdom. Okay. The end of the Middle Time period, or 1250s, there's the rediscovery of the ancients, and then by 200 years later, like I said, I don't know the dates, but we've got to be 1450s, maybe early 1400s, maybe even late 1300s. We have the start of the Renaissance period. Well, give those ancients, those Greek and Roman great philosophers, time to be copied into Latin and copied and copied and copied and then distributed, and they are influencing us again. All of Western civilization. And so they cherish the wisdom of the ancients, what they talked about. But we would say that there's probably about the same amount of people that were literate as in Middle history. So when we get to the Reformation, we'll give you some numbers that go along with that. But as far as literacy, we would say through all of middle history, and we could go all the way up to 1500, you have about the same literacy. Even though there's a rebirth of learning and wanting to know these things, that rebirth is happening just in educational circles. It does have an effect, and we will see that, because I believe the Reformation is greatly dependent upon the Renaissance. But the change is happening still in the educated class, which would be the scholastics and the ecclesiastics, that people that were churchmen or greatly influenced in those areas. So mostly, generally, the population had the same amount of education, literary meaning being able to read a language and that type of thing, as in earlier times. This time period gives us a greater, if we're looking historically, even greater appreciation and much more use of the classical languages. Okay, Latin had kind of been established. Latin was the church language, but now we're going ahead and saying, well, let's just read the Greek in Greek. The Greeks in Greek. So we have the classical language. Classical languages are gain influence, popularity. And the other thing that is really super influential to all of history that comes out of this time period is the printing press. Movable type printing press. Does anybody know anything about, what do you remember about movable type printing press? Serenity?
Gutenberg.
Gutenberg, okay? And what do we remember about Gutenberg?
One of the first books he published was the Bible.
The Bible, okay. So the Gutenberg Bible is printed and published in 1455. So that's like a sub-point of the printing press, but really it's the hugest thing about the printing press. The movable type printing press. And I say movable type on purpose. I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. I might be wrong on I'm pretty sure Gutenberg is a movable type printing press.
Yes.
And the importance of that is that obviously you have a certain number of pieces, you put them the way they should be, you print several pages of that, you use those same pieces in a different order to print another page. You're not making separate plates for everything. Imagine how many pages the Bible, you need a separate plate for every page of your book if you're before movable type. How many pages are in the Bible? You've seen those old Bibles that, and they don't have the technology, I wouldn't think, to make, print that small. So that's why the pages are this big, print is big, the Bibles are that thick, and at that point, they probably really would consider the Apocrypha to be a part of it, so that makes them that thick. So the movable type really transformed education, culture, everything. Some people would say it inaugurated the information revolution. So there's surely many more, but there's one great thinker, great educator, great whatever you want to put on name from this time period that we should remember, and he is Erasmus. Erasmus is a Renaissance man. He's very influential. And when I say influential, we should remember, I'm speaking historically. He might not have been so influential in his immediate day. We didn't have, he probably influenced his town, people visited him and learned from him, but not the immediate influence that people have today because of media and technology and all that. But his writings and his works have endured historically. And he was influential. I mean, not much longer later than him we have, I mean, he did a, compiled a text of Scripture. And people used basically his text, he did some work with our received text. And so, so he's very, very much looked up to, even close to his own day. He felt that a well-rounded teacher should know archaeology, astronomy, etymology, history, classical literature, scripture, all of that is what a teacher should know. Okay. So even though we have, in the middle of history, we have knowledge being organized into bodies, he's at the end of that time and still says, you know, a teacher is not somebody who knows everything about science, or everything about literature, you know, or everything about the classic Greeks. He really needs to know a lot about everything. And that is true. He presented a method for teaching literature, which is, I think it's worth mentioning because it's helpful if you want to teach literature. Plus, but I would say that, see, our thinking is literature, oh, that's that class, that's that subset of English studies, literature. In these days, literature was, I mean, if you were teaching literature, you could be teaching any subject. Archimedes wrote literature. Plutarch wrote literature. I don't even know the names of all those ancient Greeks. What did they do? They wrote. What is their writing? Literature. So, a great historian. Who's the great Greek historian? Starts with H, I think. Yep. Who? Anyway. So, anyway, whatever work has been written is literature. So, the way you should study literature, according to Erasmus, a method for teaching literature, is to present the author's biography. You need to know who the author is. That's going to tell you when he lived, his context for writing. You're going to, if you know when he lived, you're going to know what else was known at his time period in history. So present the author's biography. Identify the type of work. What type of work is it? Is it defensive, apologetic? What's the word for that? Is it polemic? Is it philosophical? What type of work? Is it poetry? Is it taking the form of a story? Is it historical? Okay, so all these things, see, literature is not just, you know, Dickens. Discuss the plot, if it has a plot. Okay, so the third thing he would say is discuss the plot, analyze the author's style, consider moral implications, and then a lot of philosophical issues. This is a method of studying literature that still is around today. At some point in my training, I learned about a fair amount about the way that our American forefathers were taught. George Washington, James Madison, all that. They were taught, of course that's a couple hundred years ago, and probably just a couple hundred years after Erasmus, but they were taught using basically this type of a method as far as studying literary works. And the people that I learned about this from are very convinced of America's greatness and God's providence or favor or whatever. in America's history. And so they would say, and I can't argue with them, that the education that formed our founding fathers is an education worth continuing, or if we have to, going back to. And so they would be people that would try to preserve this method of literary study, because this is how our founding fathers were taught. They learned something by studying literature, literary works in this way that allowed them to think biblically, governmentally, and all that. So, anyway, so this method, I'll just repeat it because I think I still see people looking around wondering if they got them all. Present the author's biography, identify the type of work, discuss the plot, analyze the author's style, consider the moral implications, and then explore the work's broader philosophical issues. And that's all we're going to say about the Renaissance time period. In my thinking, the Renaissance is just kind of right at the end of middle history. It sort of is, Mr. Reinhardt might disagree with this, but so it might be that it is the end, like the middle history is done by the time the Renaissance comes along. But to me, middle history goes from 500 to 1500 generally. And it's probably not really good to even say middle history, because before the Renaissance, what do we have before the Renaissance? We have the results of the Crusades. What do we have before that? We have the legacy of Charlemagne. Before that, we have Charlemagne's time period. There's several 200-year periods that are going on even all the way through middle history. But that's the way it is. So